Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're talking about fashion and food in the Elizabethan era. And today, we're going to understand the popular types of food and clothing available to people in the mid to late 1500s. The first thing you can do is pause the video and try to label the different components to an Elizabethan theatre. Now, if you do need a refresher on this, you can go to our previous video, which was all about the Elizabethan theatre, or refer back to your notes or memory and see if you can label as many components on the image on the right-hand side as possible. And when you're done, you can go ahead and just click resume on this PowerPoint. Right, so you've had to go at naming off as many components as you can. So just a reminder, there was no roof because there was no electric lighting. Flags would be raised. There'd also be a little man in there with a trumpet who would blow that to make some noise to alert people the play was starting. We had a canopy on the stage. And remember, this was symbolizing the heavens. The stage was symbolizing earth, and the trapdoor in the floor represented hell. Backstage, all the actors were men. Even the roles of women were played by men because women were not permitted to play in the theater. The groundlings were the cheap seats. Anyone could afford to go here. And generally, they were a pretty good place to watch a play from. There was a lot of interaction between the actors in the audience, and you had a front row seat. Unfortunately, if it rained, you would get wet. We had the upper gallery. This was for people who had a bit more money to spend and wanted a covered seat as well as really good acoustics. And again, that circular shape, so the sound would bounce in all different directions. So looking at some fashion trends for the Elizabethan era, we're just going to compare kind of the now and then. So starting off with headgear. In the Elizabethan era, a hat served two purposes. It would keep you warm and keep you dry, but also was a fashion statement. So adding in things like feathers or flowers was quite common. Nowadays, we wear baseball hats. Moving down to the upper body. This was called a doublet. It was a really tight fitted jacket. Underneath, you would often wear a silk shirt. And today we like our jumpers and our hoodies. Moving down to the legs. These were known as breeches or hoses. They were often a little bit puffy up top with a very tight legging. And today we like jeans. For some reason, people like rips in them. And moving on to the footwear. Leather shoes were very popular in the Elizabethan era with leather soles as well. Rubber hadn't yet been invented, and today we like our modern footwear. Fashion for the wealthy was a main way of displaying how much cash you had. And expensive materials such as silk, linen, or fine wools, they were often decorated, as we can see here on this ruff, with a lot of gold thread and different jewels. A doublet, which we've already mentioned before, this was that tight fitted jacket, and you would often put one of these ruffs here around the outside of your doublet just to make it that much fancier. Here we have our trunk hose, again, those tight leggings being worn underneath. And wealthy people would mainly wear shoes made of leather, but they would often have metallic or silver or even kind of gold buckle closures on them rather than a standard lace system, which would be used by most people. Now, moving on to fashion for the middle and the lower classes, their fashion was much more practical and was really designed around staying warm and comfortable. For this purpose, clothes were mainly made out of a rough wool, um, and they weren't all that comfortable to wear, but they were quite warm. Now, clothing was loose fitting. This was mainly for the practicalities of going to work, but also you didn't have enough cash to get your clothes tailored to fit you that much better. Men would wear a long tunic, which we can see on the right hand side. Women would often wear an ankle length dress or gown, and again, these were made out of wool. Now you can see both these individuals have a leather belt, and attached to that belt they have a knife or a dagger, which would be very useful for having for cutting up food or for doing things out in the field when you're farming, but also a leather pouch. And in here you could put the coins that you might have or any kind of keepsakes that you wish to keep on your person. Shoes were simple. They were simply made out of leather with either a slip-on system or a lace closure system. Now, moving on to food. In the Elizabethan era, people ate 3 meals a day. Breakfast was around 7 or 8 in the morning. You had your dinner at midday, and supper was between 5 and 8 p.m. Now, meat and seafood were very commonly consumed. Bread was a staple for both rich and poor, and that would be eaten with cheese or with eggs. Fruit was eaten, but only if it was cooked into pies or boiled into jams. For some reason, people in the Elizabethan era were very suspicious of fruit, and they didn't really see its nutritional benefits. They would only have it if it was boiled or cooked. And there were very strict rules in Elizabethan England in regards to who would eat which food in which given. Some foods for the wealthy. Red meat was more expensive and therefore it was favored by the wealthy, so things like beef. In addition, exotic meats like peacocks and swans, these were also quite desirable by the upper classes. The rich also enjoyed expensive seafood like trout, crab, mussels, oysters, and all of these different seafoods, they can be caught quite close to the shoreline. In the Elizabethan era, they did have large enough ocean-going vessels to sail across the oceans, but they didn't have the technological means to fish very large fish that live quite deep in the water, like tuna. So they stuck mainly to things that they could get a little bit easier, so kind of mussels, trout, pike, and salmon, stuff like that. Now, food for the middle and the lower classes, it was a bit different. Now, Elizabeth, she encouraged everyone to eat fish on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. Now, it wasn't because fish was seen as particularly healthy. It was mainly because her fishing industry was suffering, and she knew to be able to generate more income and taxation from the sale of seafood, she needed to encourage people to actually eat that seafood. A lot of times, fishermen would bring in their catch from the day and wouldn't sell it all at the markets. And we know that fish doesn't exactly keep very long unless it's refrigerated or unless it's salted. Chicken, rabbit, or pigeons, these were really affordable for the regular person. Chickens were quite good for two reasons. You could keep them alive and you could have the eggs to eat, or you could actually slaughter the chicken and eat its meat. But more commonly, people would keep chickens alive for their eggs. Rabbits were quite plentiful. They were relatively easy to snare in the wild, and their meat was okay to eat. There wasn't a lot on them, but enough to feed your family. And pigeons were a little bit different to the rubbish eating pigeons that we know today. Wild pigeons were a little bit smaller but had a much higher meat content. And the last thing that poor people really went for were vegetables. And it's not because they knew that they were healthy for them, it was simply what was available. The most common meal that poor people would eat was called pottage, and this was a vegetable soup that you would make by boiling vegetables together for days on end, and all the while you would pour in some oats to thicken it. We can see an image here of pottage below. Never had it, doesn't look particularly nice, but it did contain a lot of the nutrients that you would need to be able to function. So before we move any further, we just want to get a sense of what it was like to have a job in the Elizabethan era and what kind of salary people would earn in terms of their money in the 1500s, what the modern equivalent of that would be, and the modern equivalent of that is an annual salary. So starting off with the Queen, she would earn roughly in her time £250 per day. A nobleman, he would get anywhere from about 62 to 105 pounds per day. A servant to a member of a royal family or a very wealthy household could be expected to earn about 20p per day. A skilled laborer, so someone today like a plasterer or a builder, they'd look about 8p per day. And a farm worker, you'd be lucky if you got about 3 pence per day. Now, in terms of modern money, the Queen's daily wage was about £60,000 per day. A nobleman or a lord, they would look at getting between about 15 and 25,000 pounds per day. A servant to a royal household or a wealthy household, they get about 18 pounds in today's money. A skilled laborer, they could look at about 7 pounds per day, and a farm worker would just look at getting under £2.50 per day. Now, what does all that mean? If we put it into modern context and look at the equivalent salary today, Queen Elizabeth was earning just under £15 million per year. A nobleman, they would earn between about 3.5 and 6 million pounds a year. A servant, you're looking at about 5,000 pounds per year. A skilled laborer, about half that at just over 2,000 pounds a year. And the average individual, the average farm worker, would earn just over 773 pounds per year. Now, there is a website, the link will be in the description below, to the National Archives, where you can actually go ahead and go online. If you go to the National Archives website, you can scroll down, you can actually select a year between 1270 and modern day. Let's go for, let's say 1580. And then you can go ahead and put in, let's say 10 pounds, and that will show you exactly what that money is worth in today's context. 10 pounds is the equivalent of about 2,000. With that, you could buy a horse or 5 cows. Now, food for the middle and the working classes was quite different than that of rich people. Now, if you had money, you could just about buy any food that you wanted, but you needed to have some cash. Now, we already saw that the average farm worker would only get about 3p per day. So a lot of this food here is actually going to be incredibly difficult to get their hands on. We're looking at a lamb, just a piece of lamb per person is 8p. So that's pretty much 3 days' wage for just one piece of lamb. But things like hedgehogs, pheasants, even fish to some extent were free because you could generally catch them yourself. Bread needed to be made by the local bread maker. You weren't allowed to make it in your own home, but it was quite affordable. Bread for 4 people was only 2p. Things like milk, wild garlic, onions, blackberries, apples, all of these things were free because you could get them yourself. Wine and ale was generally pretty cheap. And carrots were also free, and we will get into why carrots were actually purple in the 1500s and not orange. Now, food for the wealthy, we don't have prices here because these prices fluctuated quite a lot based on the season and the availability, but this is just to give you some idea of what wealthy people would like to eat. So stuffed swan or pork, even a stuffed peacock, rabbit's legs for dessert. You could have things like honey cakes or apple tarts, plums, a peach pie. Again, fruit generally wasn't consumed unless it was baked into something. Salted trout, jellied eel, and veal cheeks, things that are a little bit more uncommon, but thoroughly enjoyed by people in the Elizabethan era. So we'll do a little exercise in terms of what's for supper. And we're going to imagine you're an unskilled farm laborer and your daily wage is 3p per day. Now, if you work a 6-day week, you're going to turn over 18p per week. Now, if you have the following outgoing expenses, so you rent your home, you'd never have enough money to buy one for yourself, but that's going to be about 8p per week. Renting your farm equipment and the land that you farm on is going to be about 5p per week. And your tithe for the church, you're looking at 2p per week. Just a reminder that tithe, we get the word tithe from tenth, and that was a tenth of your total income had to go back to the church. So if we've got our main salary of 18p, we subtract all of our expenses, we're only left with about 3p to be able to buy our food. So using the information listed on the screen coming up, your job is to come up with as many possible meals that you can create for yourself and your 2 other family members. So we'll advance to the next screen. Go ahead and pause it for a few moments and just see what kind of meals you could create with 3p to spend. Right now it's time for our bonus facts. The first fact is food was actually served oftentimes with the feathers or skin still attached to it. This was because eating in the Tudor era was an experience. It was a way to show off how wealthy you were. So being able to leave the feathers on was adding to that extra experience for your guests. The feathers would then be simply pulled off with the cooked meat being revealed underneath. Right, we said we get back to this. Carrots were actually purple, and purple was the most common color for carrots all the way up until about the 1600s. Now, the reason why we have orange carrots today, is because it's a hybrid breed between white and yellow carrots, make the sweet tasting carrots that we have. These purple carrots were very common in the Elizabethan era and even the medieval era, but they weren't quite as sweet, so they would be cut up into more fine pieces and put into that pottage to simply serve as a nutrient rather than added for flavor. And another fact about carrots is if you eat too much of them, either purple or orange carrots, your skin will actually turn that color. It has something to do with a chemical or enzyme within the carrots that can affect the pigment of our skin temporarily. The Tudors wore really ineffective glasses, but they tried nonetheless. We have two pairs here. One pair is actually made out of metal, came with a wooden case, and this pair was actually made out of leather. Now they would consist of a glass lens, was not for any prescription, but simply for magnification. And this came down to the reason that most people would work and read by candlelight. And it was very difficult on the eyes, caused a lot of eye strain, and there was very little that could be done other than magnifying the paper people were reading rather than providing a prescription lens to try and correct their vision. And the last one, Tudor sort of invented the doormat. London in the 1550s was not a very clean place. There was a visitor from Germany who noted that the architecture was amazing, but the city was absolutely disgusting. Lots of foul smelling mud and waste was always in the streets, and it would get all over your shoes. So, what people used to do is put different reeds and plants, these are actually called rushes, inside of the front door. So, when you would walk in, you would kind of scrape your shoes against these rushes, clean your shoes off, and then you'd be able to proceed inside without making too much of a mess. Right, that's it for our lesson today. Have a look on Show My Homework for the corresponding quiz and make sure you complete any of the tasks set by your teacher.